She is the most scandalous woman the British royal family ever desperately tried to hide. Edwina Mountbatten, the aunt of Prince Philip, was not only wealthier than the Queen, but her list of lovers was significantly longer than her string of royal titles. She transformed her aristocratic marriage into a highly public, relentless game of infidelity. She slept with a black cabaret singer in the racially rigid 1930s. She conducted a passionate, history-altering affair with the first Prime Minister of India right in front of her husband's eyes. And when she finally passed away, she took her last breath clutching a stack of steamy love letters resting right by her bedside. Hers was a life of wild, unbridled debauchery, yet it was perfectly concealed beneath the most splendid and impenetrable aristocratic shell the British Empire had ever built. To understand the woman who would shatter the rules of royal marriage and ultimately hold the heart of a nation in her hands, we have to start at the very beginning. We have to start with the money, not just wealth, but a scale of fortune so staggering that it essentially isolated her from the rest of the human race. Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley was born in 1901 into a world of absolute untouchable privilege, but that privilege was entirely engineered by one man, her maternal grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassel. Cassell's story is a cinematic epic in its own right. A German Jewish immigrant, he arrived in Britain in the 19th century with little more than a brilliant mathematical mind and a relentless drive. By the time Edwina was born, Cassel was not just a banker, he was the financier of empires. He funded the massive Aswan Dam in Egypt. He bankrolled entire railway networks across Sweden. And, most importantly, he became the private financial advisor and closest personal friend to King Edward VII. Cassel was so deeply embedded in the British establishment that he essentially held the crown's purse strings. But for all his public triumph, his private life was defined by loss. His wife died young. His only daughter, Edwina's mother Amalia, also died young, passing away when Edwina was just 11 years old. Edwina's father, Wilfred Ashley, a conservative politician, was a distant, emotionally unavailable figure who quickly remarried. He had little time and even less warmth for his fiercely intelligent, grieving daughter. And so, the young Edwina was essentially handed over to her grandfather. Sir Ernest Cassel adored her, but he was an aging titan of industry, not a nurturing parent. He housed her in Brooke House, his colossal mansion on London's Park Lane. To give you an idea of the scale, Brooke House was built using 800 tons of imported Tuscan marble. It was a fortress of luxury. But imagine for a moment being a teenager in that environment. You are surrounded by footmen, priceless art, and echoing empty marble corridors. You have everything a person could ever buy, but no one to simply ask you how your day was. You have no mother, a father who has moved on, and a grandfather who expresses love through trusts and bank accounts. Edwina learned very early that wealth could buy comfort, but it could not buy connection. When Sir Ernest Cassel died in 1921, the extent of Edwina's isolation became absolute. At just 20 years old, she inherited the lion's share of his empire. In today's money, she was worth hundreds of millions of pounds. She owned estates, she owned palaces, and she commanded an income that dwarfed that of the reigning British monarch. She was the golden heiress. When Edwina stepped out into London society to claim her place, she stepped into a world that was fundamentally broken. The generation that came of age in the early 1920s, the famous bright young things, were suffering from a collective unspoken trauma. The First World War had just wiped out millions of young men in the trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele. The survivors, both men and women, looked at the rigid conservative values of the pre-war era that had led them into that slaughter, and they rejected them completely. They drank too much, they drove too fast, and they loved recklessly. It was a frantic, hedonistic search for meaning, or at least a distraction from the void. Edwina threw herself into this world. She was undeniably striking. She had piercing, intelligent eyes, a razor-sharp wit, and a slender, modern elegance that fashion magazines adored. She was the ultimate catch. But beneath the diamonds and the endless parties, she was a young woman desperately searching for an anchor. She was looking for a family to belong to, a purpose to ground her, and someone to look past the Cassell fortune and see her. Enter Lord Louis Mountbatten. To his close friends and family, he was simply Dickie. He was the great-grandson of Queen Victoria. His cousin was the reigning King George V. He had the kind of pedigree that money simply could not buy. But behind the crisp naval uniform and the royal connections, Dickie was carrying his own profound trauma, and his family was harboring a desperate secret. The Mountbattens were originally the Battenbergs, a proud German aristocratic family. Dickie's father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had been the first Sea Lord, the highest-ranking officer in the British Royal Navy. But when the First World War broke out, the anti-German hysteria in Britain reached a fever pitch. Despite his absolute loyalty to Britain, Prince Louis was essentially forced out of his position by the press and the public simply because of his German name. The family was humiliated. The king forced them to relinquish their German titles and anglicize their name to Mountbatten. Dickie watched his father's heart break, and from that moment on, a ferocious, unyielding ambition was born within him. Dickie Mountbatten determined that he would dedicate his entire life to climbing back to the absolute pinnacle of the Royal Navy to avenge his father's disgrace. There was just one major problem. The Mountbattens had the blood, they had the titles, but they were, by aristocratic standards, practically broke. Dickie's naval salary barely covered his tailored uniforms, let alone the lifestyle required of a royal cousin with global ambitions. He needed capital. She needed a family. They met at a society dance in 1920. It is easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to dismiss their relationship as a cold, calculated transaction. But human hearts are rarely that cynical in the beginning. Dickie was genuinely dazzled by Edwina. She was vibrant, worldly, and entirely unlike the stiff, formal royal women he was used to. Edwina, in turn, was captivated by his certainty. Dickie was a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly where he was going. To a woman who felt entirely adrift, his rigid structure looked like safety. Furthermore, Dickie offered her something priceless, a direct entry into the inner sanctum of the British royal family. Through him, she wouldn't just be the granddaughter of a Jewish banker, she would be a royal insider. He proposed in India during a royal tour where he was accompanying his cousin, the Prince of Wales. Edwina had traveled halfway across the world just to be near him. When she said yes, the establishment breathed a sigh of relief. It was the perfect merger. The oldest royal bloodline secured by the newest, deepest pockets. On July 18, 1922, they were married in what the global press definitively labeled the wedding of the century. The guest list was a roll call of European royalty. The Prince of Wales, the future, briefly reigning King Edward VIII, was Dickie's best man. The crowds outside the church numbered in the tens of thousands. Edwina wore a dress of silver thread, looking every inch the fairy tale princess. They seemed to have it all. They embarked on a spectacular honeymoon, traveling first class to the United States. In Hollywood, they were treated like reigning monarchs. hobnobbing with Charlie Chaplin, who even filmed a short, playful home movie with them. They were the ultimate modern power couple, beautiful, impossibly rich, and connected to the highest levels of global power. But as the honeymoon ended and the reality of day-to-day life settled in, the grand illusion began to crack. The tragedy of the Mountbatten marriage was not born of cruelty or deception. It was born of a devastating fundamental mismatch in human architecture. When they returned to London, Dickie went back to work. He was obsessed with his naval career, throwing himself into technical studies, communications, and ship command. He viewed his life through the lens of duty, logic, and career milestones. Emotionally and physically, Dickie was a closed fortress. Close friends and later historians have widely noted that Dickie possessed almost no natural libido. Some biographers have suggested he was effectively asexual, while others believe he was simply so repressed and so focused on his ambition that physical intimacy was, at best, a minor distraction, and at worst, an uncomfortable chore. Edwina, however, was a creature of fire. The trauma of her childhood had left her with a desperate, gaping need for validation, affection, and intense emotional connection. She was a deeply physical woman who thrived on passion and attention. She needed to be the center of someone's universe to feel that she existed at all. She had bought her way into a royal family, only to find herself sharing a bed with a man who viewed her more as a quartermaster than a romantic partner. The realization was crushing. Edwina found herself trapped in the very thing she had tried to escape, a massive, echoing house surrounded by servants utterly and completely alone. The birth of their two daughters, Patricia in 1924 and Pamela in 1929, did little to bridge the gap. Edwina, deeply damaged by the loss of her own mother, lacked a natural maternal instinct. She loved her children, but she could not find her ultimate fulfillment in the nursery. The gilded cage had snapped shut. She had the title, she had the husband, and she was miserable. For generations, women in her position within the British aristocracy had a clear set of instructions. You produce an heir and a spare. You attend the charity balls. You smile for the portrait painters. And if you are suffocating from loneliness, you endure it in absolute dignified silence to protect the family name. But Edwina Mountbatten was not a traditional aristocrat. She was the granddaughter of a self-made titan who taught her that if you don't like the reality you are presented with, you buy a new one, or you break the old one down. As the 1920s progressed, Edwina looked at the quiet, desperate life laid out before her, and she made a conscious, radical decision. If her husband could not provide the passion and the emotional anchor she needed to survive, she would not sit by the window and wither away. She was going to find it somewhere else, and she was not going to be quiet about it. The rebellion was about to begin. By the late 1920s, the marriage of Lord and Lady Mountbatten had reached a critical breaking point. In the public eye, they were the absolute pinnacle of British glamour. They were the glittering royals who hosted royalty, the beautiful couple who graced the covers of society magazines, the living embodiment of post-war success. But behind the heavy mahogany doors of their London mansion, Brooke House, the reality was starkly different. They were two highly driven, deeply flawed people, trapped in a profound emotional vacuum. Dickie was married to the Royal Navy and to his own relentless ambition. Edwina was married to a man who, by all historical accounts, could not provide the physical or emotional intimacy her deeply insecure nature demanded. For the British aristocracy, there was a standard protocol for this exact situation. It was an unspoken rule that had governed the upper classes for centuries. discretion. If a lady of title found her marriage bed cold, she was permitted to seek warmth elsewhere, provided it was done quietly, within their own social circle, and without ever threatening the public facade of the marriage. Above all else, you never, ever embarrass the crown. Edwina Mountbatten, however, was not interested in protocol. She was a woman who possessed a fortune so vast it insulated her from the standard consequences of society. And she was about to push the boundaries of her marriage and the tolerance of the British Empire to their absolute breaking point. What happened next is one of the most remarkable and fiercely debated chapters in modern royal history. Instead of divorcing, a move that would have utterly destroyed Dickie's naval career and permanently exiled them both from the royal inner circle, they negotiated. They sat down and essentially engineered an open marriage. We must understand this not through the lens of modern progressive relationships, but as a desperate, pragmatic survival strategy drafted by two people who had everything to lose. Dickie Mountbatten was a supreme strategist. He looked at his marriage like a naval deployment. He knew he could not satisfy his wife's voracious appetite for passion and connection. He also knew that his entire lifestyle, his estates, his polo ponies, his staff, and his fast-track career was entirely bankrolled by Edwina's inheritance. If she left, the Mountbatten dynasty collapsed. So Dickie made the ultimate pragmatic concession. He granted Edwina complete, unhindered freedom to take lovers. In return, she continued to fund his life, manage his massive households, and play the role of the perfect, supportive royal wife when the cameras were flashing. Lord Mountbatten would later document this arrangement with a painful, matter-of-fact honesty, stating, "Edwina and I spent our lives stepping into other people's beds." But the architecture of this arrangement was heavily lopsided and entirely bizarre. While Dickie eventually took a long-term, highly discreet companion, a married Frenchwoman named Yola Letellier, whom he treated with gentlemanly distance, Edwina's pursuit of affairs was relentless, public, and chaotic. She embarked on a global hunt for distraction. She left her two young daughters, Patricia and Pamela, in the care of a fleet of nannies and governesses, often vanishing for months at a time. She traveled to the Americas, she sailed the South Seas, she danced through the capitals of Europe, and wherever she went she collected men. Her lovers were a revolving door of high society figures. There was Lord Molyneux. There was the rugged American polo champion, Laddie Sanford. There was a British officer named Bunny Phillips, a man so physically imposing and notoriously well endowed that he was affectionately dubbed the Monster by their social circle. The truly astonishing element of this era was not the affairs themselves, but how Dickie managed them. He did not turn a blind eye. He actively integrated her lovers into their lives. Dickie, despite his own emotional detachment, was prone to severe bouts of jealousy, yet his need for control overrode his pride. Edwina would write to him from her travels, openly detailing her romantic conquests. Dickie would read these letters, often responding with advice or commentary. He referred to her rotating cast of lovers simply as the boys. When Edwina returned to their estate at Broadlands, Dickie would frequently invite her current lover to stay for the weekend. He would play the gracious host, ensuring that the affair remained under his roof, under his watchful eye, and most importantly, under his control. It was a staggering display of codependency. Dickie sacrificed his traditional pride to secure his financial and social empire. Edwina sacrificed the potential for a truly fulfilling singular love to maintain her royal status and the safety net of Dickie's unwavering loyalty, but a system built on suppressed resentment and reckless indulgence is inherently unstable. Edwina's appetite for the forbidden was escalating. She was no longer satisfied with the safe, predictable affairs with polo-playing aristocrats. She was looking for a spark that could truly make her feel alive. And in the early 1930s, she found a spark that nearly burned her entire world to the ground. To understand the sheer magnitude of the scandal that was about to erupt, we must understand the rigid, unyielding social architecture of the British Empire between the world wars. The class system was absolute, but even more rigid and far more dangerous to cross was the racial divide. The upper echelons of London society loved to flirt with the avant-garde. They loved the new American jazz music. They loved the underground cabaret scenes. And they loved the exoticism of foreign entertainers. But they drew a hard, unforgiving line. Entertainers were there to amuse them, not to join them, and they certainly were not to be taken as serious romantic partners by members of the royal bloodline. Enter Leslie Hutchinson. Known to everyone simply as Hutch, he was born in Grenada and had navigated his way through New York and Paris before taking London by storm. He was a cabaret singer and pianist of extraordinary talent. He was the darling of the Prince of Wales, a favorite of Cole Porter, and the highest paid entertainer in Britain. Hutch was devastatingly handsome, charismatic, and exuded a sophisticated, magnetic charm. Wealthy, aristocratic white women threw themselves at him. He was the ultimate thrilling taboo. For a woman like Edwina Mountbatten, whose entire existence had become a rebellion against her own boredom, Hutch was irresistible. They began an intense, highly charged affair. But Edwina, reckless and intoxicated by the danger, lacked the basic survival instinct of discretion. She showered him with wildly expensive gifts, custom-made jeweled cigarette cases, gold rings. She was seen at his performances, her gaze lingering far too long. In the quiet, wood-paneled rooms of St. James's gentlemen's clubs, the whispers began. The British establishment was horrified. It was one thing for a lord's wife to sleep with a fellow lord. It was an entirely different, unforgivable offense for the cousin-in-law of the King of England to engage in a highly visible physical relationship with a black cabaret singer. They viewed it not just as a personal failing, but as an insult to the racial hierarchy that underpinned the entire British Empire. And so, society did what society does when it feels threatened. It weaponized gossip. The establishment sought to punish Edwina, to strip her of her dignity, and to turn her from a glamorous rebel into a grotesque punchline. This brings us to one of the most vicious, enduring, and almost certainly fabricated rumors in the history of the British upper class. A story began to circulate rapidly through the drawing rooms of Mayfair. The rumor alleged that during a clandestine encounter, Edwina and Hutch had experienced a severe medical emergency. The story claimed that they had suffered a physiological reaction, often described as a form of anatomical spasm or lock, that rendered them physically unable to separate. According to this malicious narrative, the panic-stricken couple had to be secretly transported from their private location to a medical facility, often cited by the gossips as the Royal Free Hospital, where doctors were forced to surgically or medically intervene to separate them, while they were hidden beneath blankets to conceal their identities. Today, historians, medical professionals, and biographers almost universally dismiss this event as a complete fabrication. It is an urban legend, a piece of folklore engineered for maximum humiliation. But the historical significance of this story does not lie in its factual accuracy. Its significance lies in the fact that the British ruling class invented it, spread it, and believed it. It was a targeted assassination of her character. By framing her affair as a medical grotesquerie, the establishment was using sexually explicit and racially charged imagery to other her. They were punishing her for daring to cross the color line, turning an act of personal rebellion into an act of physical degradation. They wanted to make her toxic, and they nearly succeeded. The rumor broke containment. It spilled out from the private clubs and reached the ears of the palace. King George V, a man of rigid Victorian morals, and his wife Queen Mary were apoplectic. The idea that the Mountbatten name, a name they had personally rehabilitated during the First World War, was being dragged through the racist, scandal-obsessed mud of London was intolerable. The pressure on Dicky was immense. The palace made it clear: control your wife, kill the story, or your career in the Royal Navy and your place in this family is over. But the crisis was about to escalate from private gossip to public spectacle. In 1932, a Sunday tabloid newspaper called The People decided to cash in on the whispers. They published a highly sensationalized, thinly veiled article. It spoke of a society woman of highly connected status who had been exiled by her family due to an association with a colored man. It referenced the hospital rumor without explicitly naming names, but to anyone in London society, the target was blaringly obvious. Edwina Mountbatten was officially front-page news. For Dicky, the naval strategist, this was a declaration of war, and he responded with the full, terrifying machinery of the British aristocracy. In a move that stunned the press and the public, Edwina Mountbatten did not hide. She sued the People newspaper for criminal libel. This was an incredibly dangerous gamble. In a libel trial, the defense could attempt to prove that the story was true. If Hutch was called to the stand, if hotel clerks or servants were subpoenaed, the entire open marriage, the endless affairs, and the reality of her life could be exposed in open court. It would mean the end of everything. But Dicky knew something the newspaper editors did not. The British legal system, at its highest levels, existed to protect the crown. The trial was a masterclass in aristocratic power and institutional cover-up. The king himself reportedly took a direct interest. Dicky pulled every string he had. He called in favors from the highest legal minds in the country. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Edwina, dressed in demure, conservative elegance, took the stand. Looking directly at the judge under oath, she swore that the article was a vicious lie. She testified that she had barely even met the man in question, let alone engaged in an intimate relationship with him. She perjured herself with absolute chilling composure. But the true killing blow was delivered by the palace. To prove that Edwina was not exiled by the royal family, Dicky orchestrated the appearance of an unimpeachable character witness. The court doors opened, and in walked the Marquis of Milford Haven, Dicky's older brother, representing the absolute inner circle of the royal family. His mere presence in the courtroom was a silent, devastating message from the king to the judge and the jury. You will find in favor of this woman, or you will face the wrath of the monarchy. The newspaper folded immediately. Terrified by the sheer weight of the establishment bearing down upon them, the editors of The People capitulated. They did not attempt to present evidence. They issued a groveling front-page apology, paid substantial financial damages to Edwina, and fired the journalist who wrote the piece. On paper, it was a total crushing victory for the Mountbattens. They had faced down the press and won. They had protected the royal facade. But behind the closed doors of Brooke House, The reality was ash. Edwina had won the legal battle, but she had lost the social war. The upper classes, forced to accept the legal verdict, retaliated with silent excommunication. The invitations to certain country estates dried up. The whispers did not stop. They merely grew quieter and more venomous. Hutch, the brilliant artist she had professed to care for, was quietly devastated by the ordeal, his own career suffering the quiet prejudices of an establishment that viewed him as the problem. Edwina realized that her wealth could buy her a favorable verdict, but it could not buy her respect, and it certainly could not buy her freedom from her own reputation. The gilded cage had not been broken. It had simply been reinforced with steel. The atmosphere in London became suffocating. Dicky, having saved his career and her reputation, returned to his naval duties with a cold, renewed focus. The emotional chasm between them was wider than ever. Exhausted, humiliated, and deeply depressed, Edwina did the only thing she knew how to do when the walls closed in. She ran. Leaving her husband and her young daughters behind, she embarked on an epic, years-long period of exile. She traveled further and faster than ever before. She trekked through the mountains of Persia. She explored the dense jungles of Central America. She sailed through the remote islands of the South Seas. It looked like the ultimate vacation, but it was, in reality, a desperate flight from herself. She was running from the scandal, from the coldness of her marriage, and from the terrifying realization that her life, despite all its privilege, lacked any genuine meaning. She was a woman burning through her inheritance, looking for a reason to exist. She could not know it at the time, but the world she was running from was about to shatter. The decadent, insulated era of the 1930s was drawing to a close. Across the English Channel, dark clouds were gathering over Europe. It would take the greatest catastrophe in human history to finally strip away the vain, lost socialite and forge the formidable, world-altering woman she was destined to become. History is often defined by its interruptions. In September 1939, the decadent, insulated world of the British aristocracy, the world of endless polo matches, extravagant cabaret nights, and scandalous open marriages, was violently erased. World War II did not care about pedigrees. It did not care about inherited wealth. As the bombs began to rain down on London, the frivolous society that had both sustained and suffocated Edwina Mountbatten vanished overnight. For many of her aristocratic peers, the war was a terrifying inconvenience. They retreated to their sprawling country estates in the shires, far from the bombing targets, waiting out the conflict with rationing books and quiet resentment. But for Edwina, the outbreak of war was not an interruption, it was a resurrection. When the war began, the woman who had spent the previous decade running away from her life suddenly turned around and ran directly into the fire. The frantic, restless energy that she had previously channeled into a revolving door of lovers and endless global travel was suddenly redirected with laser precision into public service. She did not simply lend her famous name to a charity letterhead to keep up appearances. She put on a uniform, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. And the British establishment, which had spent years trying to ostracize her, was about to realize exactly what a woman with her intellect and bottomless resources could do when she finally found a purpose. Edwina joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade and the British Red Cross. She started at the bottom, but her sheer organizational brilliance and her absolute refusal to accept bureaucratic excuses propelled her rapidly to the top. She became the superintendent-in-chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. During the darkest days of the Blitz, while her husband Dickie was commanding destroyers at sea, Edwina was on the streets of London. She worked exhaustingly long hours, often 18 to 20 hours a day. She inspected underground air raid shelters that were overflowing with terrified, displaced civilians. When she found that the sanitary conditions in the shelters were horrific, she didn't just write a report. She used her immense personal wealth and her political connections to bypass the sluggish government bureaucracy and forcibly improve them. This was the crucible that forged the real Edwina Mountbatten. The shallow, narcissistic socialite burned away in the fires of the Blitz. In her place stood a deeply pragmatic, highly effective, and fiercely empathetic leader. She traveled to the front lines, risking her own life to inspect medical facilities in North Africa and later in Southeast Asia. She walked through prisoner of war camps, witnessing levels of human suffering that permanently stripped away the last remnants of her gilded youth. She discovered that she possessed an extraordinary capacity for compassion, a compassion that had been starved in her own childhood. She couldn't fix her own marriage, but she found she could soothe the suffering of thousands of strangers. By the time the Axis powers surrendered in 1945, Edwina was a transformed woman. She was decorated, she was respected, and she was, for the first time in her life, genuinely admired by the British public, not for her money, but for her grit. But her greatest test and the defining chapter of her emotional life was still waiting for her. In early 1947, the British Empire was bankrupt, exhausted, and bleeding out. The jewel in the crown of that empire, India, was on the brink of an unprecedented catastrophe. After nearly a century of direct British rule, the demand for independence could no longer be contained, but the subcontinent was deeply fractured along religious lines between the Hindu majority and the massive Muslim minority, with the Sikh population caught in the crossfire. The British government, desperate to extricate itself from a looming civil war, gave Lord Mountbatten an impossible task. He was appointed the final Viceroy of India. His orders were brutal in their simplicity. Go to India, end British rule, and manage the transition to independence as quickly as possible. It was a ticking time bomb. The decision was made to partition the subcontinent into two independent nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The timeline Dickie imposed was incredibly aggressive. He accelerated the British departure date to August 1947, leaving just months to draw the borders of two new nations. When Edwina arrived in New Delhi as the last vicereine, the traditional expectations of her role were clear. She was supposed to host elegant garden parties, pour tea for visiting dignitaries, and maintain the serene, unflappable facade of British superiority, while her husband handled the politics. Edwina refused. As the borders were announced, absolute hell broke loose. Millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of the newly drawn lines. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan. Muslims fled India. It triggered the largest mass migration in human history, and with it came sectarian violence of unimaginable savagery. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Entire villages were massacred. Trains arrived at their destinations filled entirely with corpses. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered in a matter of weeks. Edwina did not stay in the Viceroy's palace. Against the frantic advice of her security detail, she went directly into the epicenter of the horror. She utilized every ounce of the logistical brilliance she had honed during the Blitz. She organized medical convoys, established emergency hospitals, and waded through the blood and the mud of the refugee camps. There are eyewitness accounts of her stepping directly between rioting mobs, using the sheer force of her authority and her fearlessness to stop the violence. She worked until she physically collapsed, only to get up and return to the camps the next day. She was bearing witness to the death throes of the empire her grandfather had helped finance. And it was here, in this crucible of trauma, exhaustion, and monumental historical gravity, that she met a man who would finally, permanently, anchor her soul. His name was Jawaharlal Nehru. He was the leader of the Indian National Congress, and the man destined to become the first prime minister of an independent India. To understand the impact of his collision with Edwina, you must understand the man himself. Nehru was a brilliant intellectual, educated at Harrow and Cambridge. He was an aristocrat of the mind, a philosopher-statesman who had spent a total of 9 years locked in harsh British prisons for his role in the independence movement. He was 58 years old. He was a widower, having lost his beloved wife Kamala to tuberculosis years earlier, and he was carrying the agonizing weight of a newborn, fracturing nation on his shoulders. He was surrounded by millions of followers who viewed him almost as a deity, but he was, at his core, an extraordinarily lonely man. When Edwina, aged 45, and Nehru met in the chaotic halls of the Viceroy's house, the connection was instantaneous, electric, and profound. This was not like her youthful, frantic flings with polo players or cabaret singers. This was not a desperate search for physical validation. This was a meeting of absolute equals. Nehru found in Edwina something he had not experienced in decades: an intellectual sparring partner, an emotional confidant, and a woman who possessed the capacity to understand the crushing, isolating burden of leadership. She wasn't intimidated by him. She challenged him. She soothed him. And she understood the trauma he was witnessing because she was down in the refugee camps witnessing it herself. Edwina found in Nehru the deep, intellectual, and passionate connection she had spent her entire life searching for. He saw past the Cassell millions. He saw past the scandalous reputation of the 1930s. He saw the fiercely intelligent, fiercely empathetic woman she had become. To call this simply an affair is to diminish its historical weight. They fell deeply, desperately in love. Right in the heart of the Viceroy's house, under the watchful eyes of British staff, Indian politicians, and the global press, the wife of the British Viceroy and the future leader of India forged a bond that defied every rule of protocol and politics. And the most shocking element of this entire geopolitical romance, Lord Mountbatten not only knew about it, he orchestrated the space for it to happen. This image is the ultimate distillation of the Mountbatten open marriage, evolved to its most extreme, world-altering conclusion. While India was burning, the Viceroy's wife and the Indian Prime Minister were often seen walking alone in the Mughal gardens, locked in intense conversation. They would retreat to private sitting rooms for hours, and Dickie Mountbatten, the representative of the British Crown, would deliberately ensure they were not disturbed. Historians and biographers have agonized over Dickie's motivations for decades, debating the exact nature of this love triangle. The interpretations generally fall into two distinct camps, and both reveal the staggering complexity of the people involved. The personal resignation theory. Some close to the family argued that Dickie had simply reached a point of profound emotional maturity and resignation. He loved Edwina, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could not provide the emotional and physical intensity she required. He saw that Nehru made her genuinely happy, calm, and focused. In this view, Dickie's tolerance was an act of supreme, albeit unconventional, grace. He stepped aside so his wife could experience the great love of her life. The strategic masterstroke theory. However, a more cynical and perhaps more historically grounded perspective views, Dickie's actions through the lens of pure geopolitical strategy. Dickie Mountbatten was a master manipulator of people and circumstances. He was tasked with an impossible, highly volatile transition of power. Jawaharlal Nehru was the most important piece on the chessboard. Nehru was exhausted, depressed by the violence of partition, and prone to moments of intense despair and volatility. Dickie realized that Edwina was the only person who could anchor Nehru. She was the anchor and healing presence for the Prime Minister. By allowing and even subtly encouraging their profound connection, Dickie ensured that Nehru remained emotionally tethered, accessible, and amenable to the British perspective during the chaotic, often violent independence negotiations. Did Edwina's emotional hold on Nehru influence the drawing of the borders? Did her late-night conversations with him soften his stance on the integration of certain princely states? The exact geopolitical impact of their love is impossible to quantify, but it is undeniable that their relationship kept the diplomatic channels open when the rest of the country was tearing itself apart. Dickie utilized the mechanics of his open marriage to stabilize the end of an empire. It was an astonishing gamble. He traded his pride as a husband for his success as a viceroy. On August 15, 1947, India awoke to life and freedom. The British Empire in India officially ended. The Mountbattens stayed on for another year as Dickie served as the first Governor-General of the new Dominion. But the monumental task was complete. They had overseen the birth of a nation, but the personal cost was immeasurable. For Edwina, the impending departure from India was not a return home. It was a tearing away of her soul. In June 1948, the time came for the Mountbattens to return to England. The physical separation between Edwina and Nehru was agonizing. They were two people in the twilight of their lives, deeply in love but separated by thousands of miles. Their respective duties, and the inescapable reality of their public positions. As the plane lifted off the tarmac in New Delhi, carrying her back to the damp gray skies of London and the cold, echoing halls of her marriage, Edwina left behind the only man who had ever truly seen her. But true passion, once ignited, cannot be extinguished by geography. The viceroyalty was over, but the most intense, intimate, and ultimately tragic chapter of Edwina Mountbatten's life was just beginning. The hardest part of any revolution is the day after you win. In June 1948, Edwina and Dickie Mountbatten returned to England. They had successfully dismantled the British Raj. They had overseen the birth of two independent nations. They were hailed by the establishment as historical architects. But as the heavy doors of Broadlands closed behind her, Edwina Mountbatten faced a terrifying reality. The adrenaline of the war was gone. The world-altering stakes of India were gone. And, most devastatingly, Jawaharlal Nehru was gone. She was 47 years old. She was back in the damp, quiet halls of her marriage, sharing a life with a husband who was immediately pivoting to his next naval command. Dickie was moving forward. Edwina was entirely tethered to the past. The physical separation from Nehru was a brutal amputation. For months in New Delhi, they had operated as a single intellectual and emotional unit. Now they were separated by thousands of miles, massive political responsibilities, and the rigid protocols of the Cold War era. But Edwina refused to let the connection die. If they could not share physical space, they would build a bridge out of paper. Visual, a montage of handwritten letters, ink flowing onto heavy parchment, postmarks from London, New Delhi, Geneva, and Malta. The pace of the editing matches the frantic, desperate volume of the correspondence. For the next 12 years, until the very last day of her life, Edwina and the Prime Minister of India maintained one of the most extraordinary correspondences of the 20th century. This was not a trickle of polite holiday greetings. It was a torrential flood of intimacy. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes daily. These letters, thousands of them, heavily guarded by archives today, were the lifeline for two people suffocating under the weight of their public duties. They did not just write about love, they wrote about the brutal realities of geopolitics. Nehru confessed his deep fears about the survival of his young republic, his frustrations with his cabinet, his profound loneliness at the top of the political pyramid. Edwina served as his sounding board, his unvarnished critic, and his ultimate confidant. She offered him the one thing a deity of the independence movement could not find in his own country: absolute, unfiltered honesty. They managed to see each other perhaps once a year, during Nehru's brief diplomatic trips to London or her occasional visits to India. The press would stalk them, capturing images that crackled with suppressed tension. In public, they maintained the necessary distance of statecraft. In private, they resumed the intense, profound partnership they had forged in the fires of 1947. But a few weeks of stolen time a year cannot sustain a woman whose core operating system was built on a desperate need for constant physical validation. Edwina needed an anchor in her daily life, and she found it, surprisingly, not in another lover, but in a young, traumatized boy who was about to alter the course of the British monarchy. History rightly remembers Edwina Mountbatten as the final vicereine of India. But her most lasting and perhaps most invisible impact on the 20th century was her role in shaping the man who would spend 7 decades standing one step behind Queen Elizabeth II. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was Dickie's nephew, but his childhood was a landscape of absolute chaos. His family had been exiled from Greece under the threat of execution. His father had essentially abandoned him to live with a mistress in the south of France. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, had suffered a severe mental breakdown, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and was forcibly committed to a psychiatric asylum when Philip was just 9 years old. Philip was essentially an orphan with royal blood. He had no home, no money, and no country. It was the Mountbattens who took him in. Dickie, ever the strategist, saw Philip's potential. He guided the boy into the Royal Navy, introduced him to his young cousin, Princess Elizabeth, and ruthlessly orchestrated their eventual marriage. Dickie provided the career roadmap, but it was Edwina who provided the survival guide. She became the primary maternal figure in Philip's life. When he was a penniless naval cadet, it was Edwina's inherited Cassell fortune that paid his tailor's bills, settled his mess debts, and provided him with the cash he needed to court the future Queen of England. More importantly, Edwina taught him how to survive the psychological crushing weight of the British establishment. Philip was entering a family that demanded absolute conformity, a family that had destroyed independent spirits before him. Edwina, the ultimate royal rebel, showed him another way. Look closely at the dynamic of the late Queen's marriage, and you see Edwina's fingerprints all over it. Edwina taught Philip the vital art of compartmentalization. She showed him that you can do your duty, you can serve the institution flawlessly in public, but you must carve out a private sphere for yourself, or the system will devour you alive. She modeled how to maintain your own fierce independence, your own private rebellions, while locked inside a gilded cage. She gave the Duke of Edinburgh the psychological armor he wore for the rest of his life. But while she was building up the young prince, she was systematically destroying herself. As the 1950s progressed, Edwina's health began to fail. Her doctors begged her to slow down. Her heart was weakening under the strain of her relentless schedule, but Edwina could not stop. To stop meant to sit in the quiet rooms of Broadlands. To sit in the quiet meant confronting the vast, echoing absence of Jawaharlal Nehru. It meant facing the cold reality of her marriage to Dickey, a partnership that had evolved into an efficient corporate merger but lacked any physical warmth. So, she weaponized her grief and turned it into labor. She accepted grueling, punishing international tours on behalf of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She deliberately chose the hardest, most uncomfortable assignments. She went to conflict zones, she went to leper colonies, she traveled into the deep jungle. It was as if she was trying to outrun her own mortality, or perhaps trying to earn her place on the earth by burning herself out in the service of others. She was living on black coffee, sheer willpower, and the arrival of the Daily Post. By early 1960, she was a ghost of the vibrant heiress she had once been. She was 58 years old, but her body had absorbed the mileage of 100 lifetimes. Despite suffering from severe exhaustion and agonizing headaches, she embarked on a massive inspection tour of medical and charitable facilities in Southeast Asia. It was a tour she would not survive. On February 20th, 1960, Edwina pushed through a full, exhausting day of official engagements in the oppressive tropical heat. That evening, she attended a formal reception. Those who spoke to her noted she looked pale, her energy finally flagging, but her mind remained razor sharp. She retired to her room at the governor's residence. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, Edwina Mountbatten's heart simply gave out. She died peacefully in her sleep. When her staff entered the room the next morning to wake her, they found her. And what they discovered on her bedside table is the single, most defining, heartbreaking detail of her entire existence. Visual. The camera slowly zooms in on a wooden bedside table. Resting there, illuminated by the morning light, is a thick stack of well-worn, heavily handled paper, the letters. Beside her bed, precisely stacked where she had placed them the night before, were the letters from Jawaharlal Nehru. She had not taken her husband's correspondence on this final, brutal journey. She had not taken the royal decrees. She had taken the words of the man she loved. In her final conscious moments, thousands of miles from her home, completely alone in the sweltering dark of Borneo, she had reached out for the only connection that had ever truly made her feel safe. She died with his words echoing in her mind. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the global establishment. In London, the royal family prepared for a massive state funeral. In New Delhi, the Prime Minister of India went into a state of profound private mourning. But Edwina, even in death, had orchestrated one final breathtaking act of defiance against the British establishment. In her last will and testament, Edwina Mountbatten delivered her final verdict on her marriage. She explicitly, legally refused to be buried in the Mountbatten family vault at Romsey Abbey. She refused to lie in the dark, cold stone next to Dickey for eternity. She demanded a burial at sea. She wanted the ocean. She wanted movement. She wanted absolute freedom. The ceremony was somber, heavy with the weight of naval tradition. The Archbishop of Canterbury read the committal. Dickey watched the woman who had bankrolled his dynasty, tolerated his ambition, and shattered his pride, prepared to leave him for the last time. As the coffin slid out from under the flag and plunged into the icy depths of the Atlantic, the British mourners stood at attention, but they were not alone. In a move that stunned the British Admiralty and broke every protocol of international diplomacy, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had issued a direct military order. He commanded the INS Trishul, an Indian Navy frigate that happened to be in European waters, to abandon its schedule and divert immediately to the English Channel. Nehru sent his military not to threaten, but to honor. As Edwina's coffin sank into the dark water, the Indian warship pulled alongside the British destroyer. The Indian sailors, men representing a nation that Edwina's ancestors had subjugated, lined the deck in absolute silence. Visual slow motion. From the deck of the Indian warship, sailors cast hundreds of bright orange marigolds onto the surface of the freezing gray ocean. The flowers bob on the waves, a shock of vibrant tropical color against the bleak British winter. They cast wreaths of marigolds onto the water. It was a traditional Indian gesture of profound respect and farewell. But in that specific moment, it was something much deeper. It was a heartbroken man trapped by his office on the other side of the world, utilizing the machinery of his state to reach out and touch the woman he loved one last time. It was an unprecedented act of cross-border love that transcended the empire, transcended the politics, and transcended the rigid, loveless rules of the society that had tried to break her. How do we process a life of such staggering contradictions? History often demands women choose a lane, the selfless saint or the scandalous sinner. Edwina Mountbatten refused to choose. She was a woman who utilized her vast wealth to publicly humiliate her husband, yet used that exact same wealth to pull dying refugees from the mud. She engineered a highly controversial open marriage, yet used the stability of that very partnership to help steer the geopolitical fate of millions. She was handed a script by the British Empire that demanded she endure her loneliness in silence. Instead, she tore it to pieces and wrote her own epic, a story of unapologetic rebellion, breathtaking humanitarianism, and a forbidden love that commanded warships. Edwina Mountbatten didn't just survive the rigid establishment of her time, she bent it entirely to her will.